Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the same night, actually, that I'm recording this one right here. So let's go ahead and, excuse me, I got some bagel stuck in my throat. So let's go ahead and get started. So just like the previous video, and just like all of these videos, we're going to try and keep ourselves limited to a 20-minute time span. So I'm going to put a timer on my phone in just a second, but I'm going to do a little bit of a preamble into introducing this topic right here. So this is actually going to be part two of chapter two, talking a little bit about the specific region of English colonization in the form of the New England colonies. Now, New England is a modern day term, but it is generally describing the region of modern day Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and what's that stupid state? Rhode Island. Actually, Rhode Island has some good history. So let's talk about it. So that's going to be the main thing that we focus on today. All right. In terms of the AP lesson objectives, these are just the ones that are generally covered in this particular set of presentations and chapters. So, talking about the regions, talking about interactions with Native Americans. All right. If you're curious about reading some more in the textbook, those are some of the Give Me Liberty pages right there. All right. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'm going to set myself for a 20-minute timer. All right, let us go now. All right. Now, I am not going to do this again, kind of talking about this general overview, but kind of generally, all of those things that were mentioned in the previous video are going to apply to this video as well. Not just in terms of motivations for colonization, but also in terms of these interactions with Native Americans. All right. Now let's get into actually the weeds of New England a little bit. Now, New England is a little bit of a different beast altogether in terms of why New England was set up and how it looks like politically, because there are some similarities between Virginia, between the Chesapeake, between Southern colonies, and with New England as well. Now, kind of one of the big similarities, though, is that the initial origins of the founding of New English colonies, namely places like Massachusetts Bay Colony, is going to be the social organization in the form of joint stock companies. However, despite kind of this similarity between the funding and founding of these colonies in the New World, we see that a big difference is the motivation for settling in the New World. Because Virginia's motivation was to make money, to profit economically. However, in New England, it's a little bit different. And in order to understand that, we have to understand a little bit about religion in England. As you might have learned about last year in World and Euro, you learned about the Anglican Reformation, aka the creation of the Church of England that was separate from the Catholic Church. Now, this is going to create a completely separate denomination of Christianity, Anglicanism. However, despite the fact that Anglicanism is a thing, despite the fact that it's not Catholic, it's viewed by some in England, especially some radical Protestants, as insufficiently Protestant. And actually, this causes a little bit of religious tension in England, namely between these two groups right here. And they're going to include the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Now, both of these groups will face opposition for their beliefs. They face political suppression. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But from the perspective of these two groups, there definitely is political repression. Now, what exactly did they believe in? And what is the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? Well, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans are Calvinists. Calvinists are a type of Protestant who believe in the idea of predestination. From the minute you are born, you are either going to heaven or you're going to hell. And kind of the way that you prove that you are going to heaven or hell is through public displays of leading a godly life. For example, kind of one mark of the proof that you are saved or you are damned is something known as the conversion narrative. Basically, you're put before a jury of your peers, before the congregation of people who have been accepted and are proven to be visible saints, that they're going to heaven. You're essentially judged before these people. How do you know, Mr. Viewer or Mrs. Viewer, how do you know that you are going to heaven or hell? Well, I know that I'm going to heaven because I lead this life, which is proven to be godly as seen in the Bible, as seen in the passage, insert Bible passage here. Now, kind of that is true. This kind of idea of predestination, this idea of religious belief is true between the Puritans and Pilgrims, but one thing that is different is their relationship with the Church of England. The Puritans do not want to separate from the Church of England. Rather, they want to stay in the Church of England and fix it from within. They are reformers within the Church of England. They don't want to separate completely. Whereas the Pilgrims, on the other hand, aka the separatists, they want to separate from the Church of England. So there is a little bit of nuance between the two, but both are going to face political repression for their beliefs. We see that more so with the Pilgrims because the Pilgrims were radical in wanting to separate from the Church of England. They were viewed as non-conformist, as dissidents in a way from the Church of England. And kind of these groups of people are going to especially be considered treasonous because who is the leader of the Church of England? It's the English king. And if you're saying, I don't want to be a part of the Church of England, you're basically saying, I don't want to be a part of the English king, more or less. Now, regardless of your view on the Puritans, were they oppressed or were they just religious nut jobs who wanted to move to the New World? That's a matter of historical opinion and debate. But we do see that they're not really welcomed in England. They believe that they need to move away from the old world and find their spot in the new world. First, the Pilgrims come over. They set up the Plymouth Bay colony, which is down here in modern-day Plymouth. But we also see that their success is going to lead to the Puritans setting up in Massachusetts Bay. Now, surprisingly, well, unsurprisingly, because I have early onset dementia, I failed to mention kind of one of the big ideas that helps justify why the Puritans are in the New World, and it's a concept known as the city on a hill. A guy named John Winthrop, he's the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's going to come up with this concept, basically, of what is the goal of the Puritans in the New World. And it's to create a kind of perfect settlement that is based on Puritan beliefs. We are going to organize our society based on the laws of Moses, based on the laws of the Bible, the laws of Jesus, the laws of Moses, all of those important figures in the Bible, All right. So, kind of the city on a hill really describes the collective nature of the Puritans. It really also describes a lot about the goals of the Puritans to build a pure religious society in the New World, something that the rest of the world can look up to as a shining example. And this is going to help explain actually that idea of how close-knit the Puritans were in the New World. Their communities really reflect a high degree of community and a degree of political centralization in a way. Everybody's supposed to be thinking in a sort of hive mind. In class, we compared the Puritans to bees. Bees are wonderful little insects, but they do, well, probably a good thing that the bees believe in is that they believe in a sort of community building. They believe in kind of working for the common good of the colony, get it, as a whole. So, homogenous, tight-knit communities is really what's going to define these New England societies. Now, what about places like Rhode Island? Well, actually, we'll talk about that because, in a way, these other New England colonies, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, are actually founded by people who left the Puritans in Massachusetts. They felt like they were not welcome in this perfect utopia the Puritans were trying to build. So, we'll talk more about that later, actually. But anyway, let's get into a little bit about the geography since we did so with the Virginian colonies, or the southern colonies, including Virginia. Now, the environment of New England is less suitable for cash crops. The environment of New England is better for fishing, for timber, and for shipbuilding. Kind of trade with England is a big part of Massachusetts' economy, as seen with the city of Boston, as seen with Plymouth and the Plymouth colony. These places are key trading ports in the New World. Now, in terms of kind of how the English adapted in New England, we see that especially in the kind of highly organized nature of the Puritans. Unlike what we saw in Virginia, we saw that with the Puritans in Massachusetts, they were much more methodical. They were much more pragmatic in setting up their colonies in the New World. And we see that especially with the first Great Migration. I don't know why the parentheses are in the wrong spot. It should be parentheses around first and then Great Migration. Now, this first Great Migration describes the highly organized movement of the Puritans from England to the New World. First, they send over carpenters and urban planners and farmers. These people lay the groundwork. Then, who follows are entire families. A big part of the Puritan worldview is a nuclear patriarchal family. That's sort of reflective of their understanding of the Bible. The Puritans believed that they had a special covenant with God, with the big guy upstairs, that if you live by God's words, you will be given a promised land, a sort of Zion, if you will, a land of Canaan, of milk and honey and whatnot in the New World. Now, kind of related to all of this is going to be the economy. The economy is going to be based on shipbuilding, on timber, on fishing, on fur trade as well. That's something I forgot to mention. However, that is going to reflect the nature of slavery in the New England colonies. Slavery exists in the New England colonies. However, it is not as predominant in New England as it is in the South. Predominantly, enslaved people of African descent in New England were predominantly used as domestic workers. That being said, cities like Boston, cities like Plymouth, cities like New Haven and Portsmouth in New Hampshire, these places are going to be trading centers, including the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of slaves are bought in Africa, shipped to the Americas, and sold in auction in places like Boston, for example. They are then shipped domestically within the New World down into places like Virginia. So New England is not free of the guilt of slavery, but it is less prevalent compared to Virginia and the southern colonies. All right. So we talked a lot about the Puritans in this particular section right here. Let's talk about some other aspects of their society in the New World. I'm doing pretty good on time, actually. All right. Type in the chat or the comment section. What is your favorite color? Actually, don't do that. I don't really care. No, don't do it. I do care. I care. I care. I care. That's a quote from Star Wars. Anyway, let's talk about something that is related to the political nature of New England. Well, much like Virginia, much like every other of the 13 colonies, we see that Massachusetts Bay and the other New England colonies as well, they are going to have a local representative government. And in the case of Massachusetts, kind of the overarching colonial government is the general court. Representatives from each of the towns in Massachusetts, they meet together in Boston to govern the colony as a whole. And again, remember, this is a characteristic and precedent in English colonies in the New World. Now, on the local level, within the towns, within the villages in Massachusetts, we are going to see the influence of religious democracy and political democracy. We especially see that in the idea of congregationalism. Congregationalism is a kind of form of practicing Christianity in which your beliefs are determined not necessarily from a hierarchy like we see in the Catholic Church, but it's determined by the community, by the congregation. It's those congregation people who decide your fate in the conversion narrative, for example. And kind of this idea of religious democracy, it kind of translates into local democracy. The basic character of a lot of these Puritan villages in Massachusetts is one of direct democracy, at least for some people. We, of course, see that, much like Virginia, there are limitations on who can vote. And especially in the early years of Massachusetts, the only people who are allowed to vote are the Puritans, are the religious settlers in the New World. Women can't vote because, of course, that idea of patriarchy, of nuclear families, is very similar in Massachusetts as it is in Virginia or England, for example. We see that there's obviously slavery as well. There's limitations on property ownership. These sorts of things do prevent it from being a full democracy, but compared to Virginia, and definitely compared to England, it is fairly democratic. Now, another kind of characteristic of this democracy, or at least this kind of early form of American democracy, is the focus on a sort of constitutionalism. We see that especially in Plymouth Colony with the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was written up by the Pilgrims as a kind of not exactly constitution, but more so pledge that all of the colonists will meet together and assign a collective agreement on a legal code. So, kind of the Mayflower Compact is an early example of constitutionalism in the New World. Now, we've mentioned this before, but there is going to be class hierarchies that are reflected in the political systems we discussed. For example, the Puritans in Massachusetts were rather close-minded. They were not really accepting of outside groups of people, and they kind of have a narrow view of citizenship. The Puritans, they were the elite of the colonies. They were the upper class, if you will. Whereas other residents in the colony, they weren't granted the same rights and privileges as the Puritans themselves. They were considered residents, not citizens necessarily. So that changes as time goes on, especially after something called the Dominion of New England. More on that in our next chapter. But kind of something we have mentioned a little bit is the status of women. Within Puritan society, we see that there is a big focus on large families and patriarchal nuclear families. The mom, the dad, their children, they make up the household. And we saw in class, if you remember, that there were a lot of kids in these Puritan villages, a lot of kids in these Puritan families. Be fruitful and multiply, to quote Genesis right there. Now, in terms of kind of other things, though, is that compared to Virginia, we see that restrictions on colonial women were more prevalent. Colonial women were essentially domestic, but in Virginia, there was opportunities for female property ownership. They didn't really exist in Massachusetts. Now, in kind of terms of internal class conflict, let's talk about a couple of examples. Because oftentimes the class conflict in Massachusetts reflects the religious nature of the colony. For example, kind of one thing that does lead to the fragmentation of the colony is the debates over the halfway covenant. By the 1660s, a lot of kids were failing the conversion narrative. They had to adopt what was known as the halfway covenant, which essentially said if you fail the conversion narrative, your children can still be baptized. That's different from the old way of doing things in the Puritan world. If you fail the conversion narrative before the halfway covenant, your kids are going to hell because they are not allowed to be baptized. However, that changes as a way to increase church membership. It ends up backfiring a little bit. It ends up dividing the colony on sectarian religious lines. Speaking of division over religious lines, we see the idea of antinomianism. Antinomianism is challenging religious authority. And kind of we see that is best demonstrated in Massachusetts in the form of guys and gals like Roger Williams, for example, and Anne Hutchinson. I'll write both of their names down. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, these two individuals, they were prominent critics of the Puritans. They felt that the Puritans denied individualism. The Puritans were close-minded collectivists, if you will, to use more of a modern term that has different connotations, and I regret using it now. Now, Roger Williams and his disciple, kind of his close personal ally, is Anne Hutchinson. Both of these figures argue for complete separation of church and state. They argue for complete individualism in religion, and they criticize kind of Puritan treatment of Native Americans. They believe in fairly purchasing land from indigenous people, much like another guy we'll talk about in the middle colonies. Now, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, these two antinomians, are going to kind of be an example of the religious divides within Massachusetts. Roger Williams, for example, he's going to go ahead and found, after he's exiled, the colony of Rhode Island. Rhode Island becomes a religious safe haven for all people, regardless of their background. Anybody, Christians, Jews, etc. Now, Anne Hutchinson, very similar in that regard because of her beliefs. But what's notable about her is, well, her pronouns, is that she's a woman. She is a woman who speaks up against kind of this strict patriarchal system. Now, The other thing that I have not actually mentioned up here is going to be the divisions that come as a result of something known very famously as the Salem witch trials in the 1690s. The Salem witch trials are going to be a series of legal trials that do result in a lot of internal suspicion, jealousy, and separation. Kind of as a little bit of background for the Salem witch trials, we see that there's a lot of competition for land within these Puritan villages. Initially, they are given out land on a basis of a lottery system, but as time goes on, they stop that lottery system. It's more based on bidding wars, if you will, kind of auctions, etc. And this creates a lot of political and economic jealousy between the different groups of people living in Puritan villages, including Salem, for example. Religious and political leaders oftentimes allowed for this division to happen because they didn't really stop these divides based on accusations of witchcraft. Witchcraft is a sin, it's punishable by death. It has no precedence in Massachusetts history. So, the Salem witch trials are another example of how the Massachusetts Bay Colony do eventually fall apart. Now, in terms of the interactions with the Native Americans, they're almost identical to what we saw with the Virginians, with the Powhatan Confederacy. Initially, as you might remember from grade school, there are rather positive interactions in the form of the relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag gave food in exchange for weapons and manufactured products. However, as more and more settlers in Massachusetts, as more and more settlers in places like Plymouth colony come, it does lead to the displacement of indigenous people, which does lead to conflict. Native Americans try to stop their displacement in the form of warfare. The most devastating example is King Philip's War, aka Metacom's War. I'll write down that alternate name as well. It sometimes pops up. Metacom's War, this is a war between the Puritans and the Wampanoag. And that kind of perfectly leads to the end of this particular chapter right here. I've covered everything that you would definitely need to know about New England. Some of the things to take away, think about kind of the motivations, think about how they organize their society, think about some of their religious beliefs. Those are some of the big ideas to take away from New England. All right, well, that is perfectly done. I'm going to drink a bunch of water and I'm going to eat some dinner before moving on to the Middle colonies. I don't know why I said it that way. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Have an excellent God-fearing day. Gosh bless America. All right. And here, I'm the Joker, baby. I'm the Joker. The Joker. All right. And stop